Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and today I'm coming to you from Yugambeh country in Queensland. And before we dive into our conversation today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community.
The Lentil Intervention is an Australasian educational and advocacy platform dedicated to raising awareness about the current climate and health crisis.
And on this podcast, we invite guests to chat about topics that will inspire you to take action to improve your own health and the health of the planet.
So please subscribe to and share this podcast and visit our website for the full show notes.
And don't forget to buy us a coffee if you'd like to support our work.
Season 3, Episode 3, and we are so excited for our next guest all the way from Stockton, New Jersey in the US as we take a real and honest dive into the world of whole food, plant-based eating.
That's right. So Anthony Dissen joins us today. He's a registered dietitian, a public health educator and a professor in the School of Health Sciences at Stockton University in the US. And if that's not enough to keep him busy, he's also currently completing a doctorate in education. I'm so thrilled that we can have Anthony as a guest today because he's a master communicator. He's got a fantastic understanding of the scientific method, in addition to a really well-rounded experience and view of all things health, which is a good thing as we'll be tackling some juicy topics today that continue to divide people in our little corner of the world within the plant-based community. And Anthony, you're actually one of the very first plant-based dietitians I ever stumbled across way back when in, 2008, 2009. So it's just so lovely to be able to have you on the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you. That makes me even happier to be here. That's really fantastic.
You may be part of the reason I actually did dietetics, if I think about it. So.
Well, then you're giving me way too much flattery right now. That's just wonderful. I hope not to disappoint.
Wow, here we go. We've set that bar high and we're going to have to deliver.
No pressure, no pressure.
Well,
I'll make sure.
On the show, we've spoken often about the importance of communication in the world of science, and a lot of that has been related around environmental issues, and we've had some wonderful guests, wonderful communicators in that space. But in the space of nutrition and whole food, plant-based nutrition, Anthony, welcome to the show. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. Let's start off the formalities. Tell us about yourself, your background, your public health education, why you went into what you're doing, and then ultimately why whole food plant-based.
Absolutely. So I'll give the most concise, summary of all of this as I can. And anytime I'm asked this question, I always let people know my career has been completely by accident. I had never even heard of a dietitian when I went on to study nutrition and dietetics. I had a completely different career path in mind for myself. But then the summer before I would have started my undergraduate university experience, I discovered a vegan chef, a plant-based chef in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, who was just talking about food in a way I'd never heard anybody speak about food before. And it just captivated me. I absolutely loved it. I loved health as a topic. I loved the act of eating and the act of cooking and all things food. But I was not vegan, vegetarian, plant-based, anything at that point. But because of this exposure, I spent that summer buying up her cookbooks and just getting exposed to all of this new way. And I saw some pretty significant changes in my health and well-being, and it just completely shifted me. So I was already having a mindset of a vegan, plant-based, whole food approach to nutrition when I went to undergraduate, when I went to university. And again, I discovered nutrition completely by accident as a field of study. My intention was to study biology, specifically to study microbiology, and the professor who gave the introductory lecture on what the major would look like was terribly boring and uninteresting. And I just thought, I don't know if I want to study this. And I had to pick a second major, and I'm flipping through this thing, and it said nutrition. Like, I never even thought of studying nutrition before. That's pretty cool. So I went to that presentation, and the professor who laid that said there's two ways. If you want to work with people, you want to be a dietitian, and if you want to do research, you do this option. I thought, I don't know what a dietitian is, but I would love to talk to people about nutrition and health. And I just stumbled completely by accident into this entire career. I couldn't have planned it any worse in terms of any sort of mindful approach to what my education or career was going to be. But it has just been the happiest accident of my life because it introduced me to a field of work and study and profession that I had never up until that point thought about. So I completed my undergraduate education in dietetics. I don't know what it is in your neck of the woods, Emma. You'll have to tell me. But after we complete our undergraduate degree here, we have to do a year-long clinical internship. Is that similar for yourself as well?
Similar, but that's all part and parcel of our actual studies.
Oh, that's nice. That's wonderful because it's a little more chaotic here in terms of you finish this and then you have to apply to this big, complicated thing. But went through this next experience, and I was very lucky that the program I went to had a dual concentration in both clinical nutrition and community health. And that was really something that spoke to me very well because I was interested in both. I was really interested in community health and wellness and talking to people. I love talking to people about these subjects. So I really wanted to do something that would allow me to understand health from the public health side, but also get a very rigorous, robust clinical hospital-based education as well. And started to do my work as a dietitian afterwards as an outpatient and community education dietitian. And so that's how I started my career. And I wasn't necessarily, how do I want to say, advertising myself as a plant-based dietitian at the time, but certainly just trying to be as evidence-based as I could, giving people information. And then opportunities came for me to do more and more work in the community. And there was a great demand for people that did understand vegan and plant-based nutrition. And that just became the course of where I was pulled into, and that has led me forward ever since. So it's been a very open field. It's been a very open career because people are just hungry for this information.
Now, I've got to say, if this has all been an accident, your resume is pretty damn impressive. You've been, like a trailblazer basically for quite a while now. You've been responsible for implementing a number of evidence-based nutrition and health initiatives, and you've also published some really interesting papers that we'll talk to soon. So you've got that scientific background, but you've also got a background teaching more Eastern, I suppose, I'm using air quotes here, but holistic modalities like Qigong and yoga. And, that's not to say that Western science isn't now catching up in terms of researching the benefits associated with these types of things. But this puts you in a really lovely position to be able to walk those two paths. So how do you kind of marry up your Eastern learnings with the scientific method that now kind of guides your work?
No, I know that is a good question because it comes up a lot because it often seems like those two things are not compatible with each other, and people on both sides of the philosophy certainly make it seem that way at times. But what I, again, happy accident, had the great opportunity was to be exposed to some of these Eastern practices like Qigong, yoga, meditation, Eastern approaches to nutrition like Chinese dietary therapy, through teachers who really knew what they were talking about, and they did it in their own way through what might be considered their own scientific method of really rooting their teachings and their practices in history. And I've always really had an interest in the history of things because what is happening in certain respects with some of these practices is they are getting a bit westernized, and what I mean by that at least is they're being stripped of their culture, they're being stripped of their history, and they're just sort of being repackaged as yoga for busy people on the go and meditation for executives and this kind of thing where it's stripped of its roots. And so when you really look at the history, these things are very rooted in trial and error and observation in so many of the things I think that we would value in what we might think of as a Western scientific method of scrutiny, observation, testability, retestability, keeping what appears to be true, letting go of what's no longer working in time. So just by happenstance, just by accident again, being able to be exposed to these by people who really took the cultural core of these practices very seriously and made sure that if we were going to be students of them, people that were going to be interested in either being professionals with them or just for our own lives, that we really understood where they came from and the breadth of history and the breadth of wisdom that was behind them. And as you said, now a lot of Western researchers are very interested in how yoga affects the body and mindfulness affects the brain. So it's interesting now to be able to talk about these things not as alternatives to other forms of healthcare, but healthcare in of themselves, that these are legitimate forms of health practice, and the language that's been used to describe them is now also being described in what we might call a Western scientific language as well, so people can understand it from a variety of different angles, which is really exciting.
Yeah, lifestyle medicine, it's really catching on, isn't it?
Absolutely, exactly right. Now people are dedicating, medical practices to teaching people about the benefits of sleep and movement and stress management, which just a few decades ago would have been seen as sort of a silly waste of time discussion for people, and now it's board certifications that people are seeking out. So it's very exciting.
You mentioned at the beginning, and this is going to really set the foundation for our discussion, but you mentioned a lot of your journey has been around evidence-based science, and that's been part of your journey to adopting a vegan, whole food, plant-based diet, whatever we're going to decide on calling it.
Yes.
But it's also the balance between, but a lot of that evidence can be questionable. Was it a study of just 10 people? But hey, it's a science and it's a paper, and we follow what that says. Versus, like you say, in a lot of Eastern cultures, it might be thousands of years of effectively, what do you call it? Almost epidemiological study of it's legit. It's been trial and error until you've found. So how do you actually get that balance? From your perspective.
So I think the way that I try to achieve that balance is exactly kind of what you described there, Ben, is like really looking at, well, how are these things conducted? So as part of my education, especially in my early years, it was really hammered into my head the importance of knowing how to read a research article, knowing the research methods. Even if you didn't think that you were ever going to go into research yourself, it was important to know these things. And so with the way academia and academic research is set up right now, and this is especially true here in the States, it is a very brutal area to be in, where you are expected to just publish constantly, especially if you're at a certain type of university. So as a result, the quality of research is getting a bit muddy in some areas, where people who need X number of publications are just trying to get them out as quickly as possible. So that might lead to small sample sizes, that might lead to questionable methods, that might lead to slight ways of hedging your bets in your favor so that you get something that can be published, because a lot of researchers, who I don't believe are trying to do poor quality research, but they're just under tremendous pressures to get as many papers out there as they can. This has also birthed predatory journals that basically say, well, if you've got a credit card, regardless of the quality of your study, we will publish it. And so now, again, we get very mixed quality research that not just the average person, but the average professional doesn't necessarily know how to discern and look at a journal and determine if it's a predatory journal or a respectable journal or not. So it's getting harder on that side of things to understand good versus not so legitimate information unless you really take your time. What I think perhaps maybe on the flip side of the coin, if you will, or on the Eastern side, is because there is such history. I think a lot of teachers and a lot of professionals that study things like meditation and Buddhist philosophy and psychology and yoga are able to take their time a bit, because they have books and they have sutras and they have all of these long-held wisdom traditions of not necessarily needing to prove anything, again, air quotes. If people want to do research on the benefits of yoga, that's lovely, but that's not going to make or break the existence of yoga, whether a positive research article comes out about it or not. But on the Western modalities of things, if I'm trying to prove my nutritional intervention is effective or not effective or better than that program, there's not as much history. Nutrition in the West is barely 100 years old in terms of our actual study of nutritional sciences in terms of isolating food by nutrients. So it's still so young, and as a result, people are still hesitant, I think, to rest in the history because there's not as much. We don't have thousands of years of practice in this, where we just have decades of practice to build on.
Yeah, and I suppose in the world of nutrition, it's always going to be a little bit frustrating as well because you're never going to be able to do those long-term randomized control trials that are considered, the gold standard because it's just not feasible or ethical.
Absolutely.
But it's,
Exactly.
it's still really important, though, to understand, how to interpret the data, taking a step back and looking at the totality of the evidence. And that leads very nicely into... you've published a number of papers, and hopefully we'll chat to all of them, but there's one in particular I think will set the tone, the I Read It Online paper.
Yes.
Because, there's so many people now that are seeking health information online. I know this was specific to undergrad students, but it's probably relevant to a lot of people that, Dr. Google. So tell us a little bit about that study and the concerning but not too surprising findings that you had.
Absolutely. I really loved that study, and I got to work on it with 2 undergraduate students, which was always a joy. So I actually got the idea for this study, which was assessing how people determine the quality of the health information they find online, at a conference that I had been attending that was on democracy and political literacy. And somebody had just in passing had said something that, we're seeing the same things in this idea of fake news and how do you determine whether the information you're coming across is accurate, as the same people who consult Dr. Google. And that just sort of put a light bulb in my head of, well, isn't that an interesting question about whether it's a godsend or whether it's a disaster? We use the internet now to seek out health information. That's just the fact of how a lot of people seek out information. That's how a lot of healthcare professionals seek out information. How good are people at doing this? And I specifically wanted to look at undergraduate students because based on their age, they're considered to be digital natives, where they've grown up with the internet. A lot of them have grown up with smartphones. And so they're just sort of sometimes assumed to be really good at navigating the internet and knowing good information from not good information. And I just wanted to see, well, how true is that? So we did a study where we took a list of websites. About half were considered to be legitimate sources of health information, whether they were a professional organization or a well-established, reputable journalism site. And then some others that were not necessarily considered to be reputable sources of information. They had clear bias. They had very specific political agendas they were trying to push. And all we asked people to do was click on each one, spend as much time as they'd like with it, go to other pages. You'll basically navigate it as close to normally as they would, and then just simply click yes or no. Do you think this is a legitimate source of health information? And then it would take them to the next. And then the last question we asked was, what do you do to determine the quality, the accuracy of the health information you come across when you search for information online? And the results were really fascinating. And what we found was that the legitimate sites, for the most part, people were really good at identifying. But the not so legitimate, the not so accurate sites, they were not very good at identifying as poor quality sites. In some cases, really quite staggeringly high numbers of people indicated that the poor quality site was indeed a legitimate site. And what we found was one of the reasons for that is they just looked at what that domain designation. If it was a .com, it was bad, and if it was a .org, it was good. And what's interesting is that's what I was taught as a student. And to a certain degree, that used to be true, but now that anybody can go online and use a website builder, like I have no idea how to HTML, I don't know how to code. I couldn't begin to build a website from scratch, but I can go to any number of website builders, some are free, and create a website, and they do all that work for me. And if you have enough money, you can buy a .org. So it's not as the gatekeepers of information aren't quite what they used to be. So some of the information they were taught is just no longer accurate or no longer useful for the way that the digital landscape is changing. if they felt that the website was designed well, they took that as a sign of legitimacy as opposed to the content. So what we might call face validity, they just sort of looked at it and said, well, it looks really professional. They must have a web builder. It must be true. And some other things that just really showed that even these so-called digital natives are not really quite educated. They're not very well trained on how to fact check, how to look for original sources of information before determining whether they think something is accurate or not. And it sort of leaves us all a bit chilled to think, well, if they're not good at it, who is? So who else is coming across health information online and not necessarily finding themselves equipped with the tools to determine if there's clear bias, there might be some good information, or this is clearly well reputable information.
So you round out that study with a few, key fact-checking skills to start to implement. So what can the average person start to do to make sure that they're looking at legitimate sources of information?
So I think two of the things that most people would be able to do is first to, as much as possible, find the original information, the original source, because most health information that's found online is not original. And what I mean by that, if I post something on my social media, it's probably not an article I wrote. It's probably an article somebody else wrote that's referencing a study they themselves did not conduct, but they're talking about the results of. So as much as possible to go and try to find the study, to try to find the original information. And I think this is especially true for people in the whole food plant-based world because, and I'm sure we'll chat about this in a bit, there are some tactics being used by some figures within the whole food plant-based world where if you go to the original source, the primary source of information that they are quoting to make this claim about the healthfulness of certain foods or the lack of healthfulness of other foods, you see a very different picture if you go to the original source. Because unfortunately, authority is a very poor source of confidence when it comes to the accuracy of health information, we find. So as much as one is able to try to find the original source. The other thing that can be very helpful is to try to find just the general reputation of the speaker. So whether that's of an organization. So for example, in the study that we did, we pulled up a pediatric organization that was well known to be a hate group. That this was a group that had very hateful political ideology, very restrictive in a lot of different areas. And if you just did a cursory search on the reputation of this particular group, you would easily find that. So if there is somebody making claims, you might just take a moment to see, well, what are other people, maybe other professionals or other organizations, stating to be the general reputation of this person or this organization? Does it seem that they have a good background? Does it seem like you can find out what their education is? I always find this to be a key thing, especially in health. If you can't find out where somebody went to school or how they got their training, that's typically a red flag that they don't want you to find that out. Not that we all have to be posting our degrees everywhere, but it should be relatively simple for someone to find out where somebody got their education. Are they truly certified in the profession that they're claiming to be a part of? And again, what are other health-based organizations saying about these claims? Not to say that that automatically validates or invalidates that claim, but if somebody is saying something about diet and heart health, and a number of organizations are saying the opposite of that, or are saying that there's a lot of concerning worry that is coming up with these claims, it might just be something that says, I might want to look into this a bit more before I make these changes in my own health. So I think that can be very helpful. And then lastly, what we would say is to go back then to the original thing you read and then just make as informed a decision as you can. Based on what you found with the original information, the reputation, does it make you feel that this does seem to be some legitimate information, or does it make you feel that some further research might be warranted?
This just sounds very hard and too much effort, and that's the true reality, because this paper is based on undergrad students. I mean, these are individuals that have an obligation to at least check their sources and so on. But when we're talking about the mass population, they don't go to websites. And first, let me tell you, getting a .org, super cheap, right? We've got a .org. We'd love to get more traffic to our website.
See, I told you we'd be more trusted if we went .org.
But It's social media that's the problem. And the social media is, I mean, never mind the likes of Joe Rogan's roaming this bloody earth, but anyone can and does. And social media is quick. There is no time to check. You know, there's a story that goes up. You've got those 15 seconds or whatever to, you've heard something. And if it's repetitive, it's embedded. And we know what the power of repetition does. It becomes the truth because I've heard it so many times, it's got to be right. So social media is really where the big risk is. And we see it a lot ourselves where people do take some information, misinterpret it, whether it's purposely or not, you know, just naively that's what I read it as, and do a post. And then they have a good following simply because they're good looking or they've got achievements in their lives or whatever, that, you know, and that's part of the problem with social media is the following that some individuals have is not really related to, you know, the true sort of definition of why they should be influencers in that sense. But that's where the challenges are, more so, I would say.
Oh, 100%. And interesting you would say that because the latest study that I'm working on right now is doing this with social media. So as soon as the results come out, I will share it with you both because I think it'll be interesting. But to your exact point that even websites are becoming a bit archaic and outdated, and Instagram and other sorts of social media sites are where a lot of health information is shared through posts, hashtags, stories. And that is becoming harder, and it presents now its own unique challenges because, and I'm sure you've both seen this, now there are fights happening on social media between this person and this person who are ostensibly part of the same group, right? They're part of the same whole food, plant-based, trying to make the world better group, and now they're arguing with each other, and then they create their bases of I'm a Dr. So-and-so person.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's just breeding more and more issue. And so I think to combat this a bit, as much as possible, is to try to maybe use social media as a place to hear something. But before believing it, before going to it, again, as much as we can, try to fact check it a bit. It is cumbersome and it takes time and it's annoying and frustrating, and as much as possible, then I try to just say to people, are there professionals you really trust? If there are people that you really trust who you think have a message that is as unbiased and as evidence-based as possible, that's what we're supposed to be for the public as healthcare professionals, is we're supposed to be people that are translating this information and making it digestible, so to speak, making it accessible to some way. But I actually loved what you said there, Ben, because that's a common tactic that is used is if you put a model up there, if you put someone who's very young and very athletic, and people will be inclined to believe anything they say. And so not to say that just because someone's young and fit, they're not to be trusted, but just to be aware of these things of if is that where my main information is coming from, I might want to pair it with somebody else who maybe does have a bit more of a professional background behind them and see what they may be saying as well.
Yeah.
It is hard.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. It's a minefield. But let's take some of these discussion points then and talk shop a little bit about a whole food plant-based diet. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth here, so gents, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it would be fair to say that we're all advocates of the many benefits of a plant-based diet, but we potentially share some concerns about certain messaging and judgments within the community, and potentially even the interpretation or lack of recognition of certain, scientific papers. There's probably one topic that divides and enrages people more than any other, and that would be the use of oil in a plant-based diet, and whether it's healthy or enemy number one. And Anthony, you did a really interesting Instagram post addressing this topic, and I'd love for you to be able to just unpack that in a bit more detail here. Would you give us an overview of that?
Sure. I know of all of the things to divide us, who would have ever thought oil would have been the one? And I remember very clearly the first time I ever came across a message in this community saying no oil, and I just thought that was the most surprising thing. If we're trying to get people to eat more plant-rich foods, move away from animal-based foods, why focus on oil? But as you said, this is just probably the topic, almost more than anything else. So
actually, can I read one thing though, because it kind of helps set that scene as well.
Yes.
As a matter of interest, what was your first plant-based related nutrition type book that you read? Just out of curiosity.
Oh my goodness, what a great question. I would say, to be fully, probably one of the earliest was the China study. That was probably one of the first ones that I came across. Yes.
Okay, bang on.
I think for a lot of us that tends to be the case.
For Emma and I, and for a lot of our guests. Now, I've got here the China study solution. And China study was my first book. And I go into the section of here, what is oil? And I'll kind of go down to get to the point. All oils and pure fat products are entirely unnatural. In nature, you will never stumble upon any repositories of edible oils or pure fats, solid fats. And I'll leave it at that. So,
Sure.
Apologies for butting in, but I just kind of wanted to make that point, because when you say, where did this whole no oils come from? Well, this is where my understanding and influence started. Whole food, plant-based, no oil.
No oil, absolutely. Yes, exactly. So, oil. I don't even know where to start. So, but my Instagram rant about this was
Do
very
we believe
much,
it?
Yeah, exactly. Good to fact check me. But exactly, was this article had come out on a very popular plant-based website, and it basically was talking about a study that had just recently been published, that once again showed that people who consumed extra virgin olive oil, typically in the higher quantities, and understand by this definition, higher quantities was something like 2 tablespoons a day, so not bucket loads of the stuff, but just normal culinary use, lived longer, ate more vegetables, had less cardiovascular disease. This is by no means new. There are many studies that showed this. And not surprisingly, this article was trying to debunk it a bit, or to try to say that people should not necessarily use this as a means of trying to add oil back into their diet if they had been avoiding it. And I would just like to say I have absolutely no skin in this game. Whether people use olive oil or don't use olive oil, I have no interest one way or the other. All I can say is the preponderance of the information, of the data out there, very much favors olive oil either having a completely neutral impact on our health, or perhaps even a very positive impact on our health. But what frustrated me in this article, and I think what led me to my little rant, was what this article had done then was it started to quote some well-known people within the whole food plant-based world that are famously anti-oil, and specifically started to bring up research articles and saying, this study here shows that oil's bad for you, this study here shows that oil's bad for you. And so I tried to practice what I preach, and I found the studies, I found the original articles, and they were either completely misinterpreted or were very poorly designed. So, for example, one of the studies that was mentioned in this anti-oil article was saying that a study conducted several decades ago, which is always another red flag too, science changes over time, showed that adding olive oil to your food made your what's called flow-mediated dilation worse, which is how well blood is flowing through your cardiovascular system. And so I went to the study, and that is not what it found. What it found was that if you ate nothing but oil and bread, and that was it, that it showed some decrease. But if that was used alongside something like salad, so maybe what more of us would use in a meal, salad that had oil and vinegar and bread associated with it, it caused absolutely no harm to our flow-mediated dilation at all. And then the other thing that they had quoted was, again, a study done by this particular physician that was shockingly bad. It was really quite shockingly poorly designed. And I was a bit, not to be too cliche, but I was dumbfounded that such a poorly designed study was being used to make this claim that a very well-designed, well-controlled, thousands of people followed over numerous years study that had come out of this Harvard article, that this really poorly designed study somehow debunked and debased and completely disproved everything that this very meticulously followed longitudinal study had found. And that, to me, bothers me on so many levels, but especially for those of us that are trying to advocate for a more plant-based diet, for personal health, for planetary health, for all these various reasons. This kind of poor science works against us. This gives ammunition, if you will, to the people who say these whole food plant-based people don't know what they're talking about. They're anti-science. They're making these things up. don't listen to them. And if I was somebody who felt that way and I saw this article and I saw how poorly written and poorly cited it was, I would say, see, this proves the point that these whole food plant-based people have a clear agenda. They're not following what the science says. We should not be advocating for people to do the same. So in the effort of trying to push this anti-oil message, we are both ignoring all of this evidence that's coming out that shows that indeed olive oil can be not just neutral, but actually rather potentially helpful for us. But we're also only weakening our position as trying to be an evidence-based set of professionals and advocates and educators and coaches, etc., if we're going off of very poorly designed research. And so I just think we need to be just as scrutinous with ourselves as we would be if the article was advocating for a ketogenic diet. People would have pounced on that to say how poorly designed it was, but because it was an article about olive oil maybe not being so good, it's praised as being the latest bit of evidence that says that we shouldn't be putting oil on our salad.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I found it a little bit arrogant, basically, that a lot of people within the community are automatically dismissing any new evidence and then not keeping an open mind to evolving research. So if you're not looking at science objectively, and if you're ignoring new evidence, and if you're putting your belief in, a handful of certain people rather than have a look at the totality of the evidence, that's more akin to religion than it is science.
Exactly.
And as you said, we would absolutely drag people over the coals in the keto and carnivore crowd, for example, for doing that.
So what's the agenda? I understand the issue around, and again, I mean, there's a debate what processed means.
Yes.
The calorie density, if you need to follow a lower fat way of eating for various health reasons. But what is the agenda? What is the issue with oils? Why is this piece of information or data being, do I use the word manipulated?
No, I couldn't think of a better word myself. I think that's exactly it. And I would frankly love to know a bit more why. I have my thoughts, and especially just speaking from the history of the health movement in the United States, there is a long history in what is sometimes referred to as the nature cure or the natural hygiene community, which really pushed a lot of these early messages of very low calorie, no oil, basically just fruits and vegetables. The idea that even that grains weren't good for you, legumes weren't good for you, certainly that animal products weren't good for you. And I see a bit of this as a continuation of that. And interestingly, some of the loudest not all, but some of the loudest voices that are anti-oil do have some connection back to this natural hygiene, nature cure history, this family tree, if you will. So I think part of it is just this continuation of a very old story that at least in the United States has been told for the last 100 or so years. The other thing is oil is such an easy target. Oil, while it may not exist in great caves and globs of oil in nature, well, neither does bread. But that there are healthcare people that are saying anti-oil that would say, but you should load your diet up in bread. But there's no bread reserves in the world, right? It's a food that has to be created. It's a food that has to be processed. There's no such thing as a tofu mine. It's a food that is processed. So, and I hear this often. I was asked to do some consultation for an organization that was trying to get started, and they were of this very anti-oil mindset. And they kept saying, well, how many steps of processing is too much? And I don't know what that means. Most food we eat is processed. The rice I eat is processed because I can't eat the hull of the rice. So they had to do something to make that brown rice edible. It might be different than if I took that rice and polished it more and ground it into flour and mixed salt and oil and fried it and called it a chip. Okay, it's a bit different. It's a bit more processed. But this idea that just because something doesn't exist raw in of itself in nature is sort of a weak argument for its healthfulness. And with oil, since oil is something that is typically added to food, it's very easy to then make it seem like a culprit, as opposed to maybe protein or carbohydrate or other things that are going to be more naturally present in food. Oil just has this interesting kind of texture and look and flavor. And it's something that we've heard for decades about how healthy it is for us. And so it does tend to be very controversial and shocking and kind of perks people's ears up a bit, I think, to suddenly hear, no, don't eat that. That's not good for you. I just think sometimes we want to hear shocking information. And unfortunately, a lot of people fall victim to the same kinds of conflicts that many people in many industries do, which is I have to sell my book. I have to sell tickets to my symposium. I have to sell tickets to my immersion. I have to sell tickets to my special one day only $700 a ticket event. And so this becomes a bit of a gimmick, I think, that's followed of I'm the anti-oil person and one drop you're out sternness that just catches a certain number of people's attention. If somebody said you couldn't eat, I don't know, salt, which again, some of these people are very anti-salt as well, but it just doesn't pick up, oh, I've heard my whole life I'm not supposed to eat a lot of salt. But oil, I thought oil was supposed to be good for me. So I just think it hits the ear in a very specific way. And the other thing is there haven't been studies that compare a whole food plant-based diet, no oil, to a whole food plant-based diet with oil, with nuts, with seeds and avocados to see, is there really that much of a difference? Maybe the oil, nut, seed, avocado people do better in certain markers, or maybe there's really no difference, but those studies have not been done, so there's also nothing that really can disprove their claim. So it's just an easy one to continue on. And so I think it just becomes this stay the course, toe the party line. This is what I've built a career on. If I suddenly go against oil and say, actually, a little bit is okay, who's going to listen to my lectures anymore? Who's going to come to my presentations? That's one of the things that really started to worry me because, like Emma said, science is supposed to evolve. And we're not supposed to say the same thing I was saying 70 years ago because we base it on new information. But you go to these nutrition conferences, especially these plant-based conferences, it's the same speakers showing the same slides, saying the same year after year. And that is a big flag that they are not keeping up to date with new recommendations, new information, new research. When you publish a slide that shows a study from the 60s, that is just a sign that you're purposely not keeping up with new information as it comes across.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, I've got to preface this by saying I prefer to cook without oil, but like that's my personal preference, right? And as a health practitioner, I need to put that personal preference aside because what works for me personally doesn't mean I should extrapolate that and say that this is the only dietary strategy that will work for absolutely everyone. I mean, get real. Like I've got some clients with, rheumatoid arthritis, for example, that need to remain oil-free to remain symptom-free. But then on the flip side, I've got other clients that wouldn't eat nearly as many vegetables if they weren't using the oil. So to just, as you say, like toe the line with this one particular message and don't never waver from that regardless of the new information that's presented, it's really, really concerning. And I might need to be educated here, but going back to that Vogel study that a lot of people always, call back to, that was studying acute changes. And I still don't know if I'm sold on whether that's something I realistically need to even care about because compared to chronic FMD dysfunction, which is linked to, CBD, like we get acute FMD changes from exercise and sleep and no one's going around saying that that's bad for you. So like we're zooming so far in on this one pixel that we can no longer see the big picture anymore. And I think that's a message that gets lost a little bit in this conversation.
No, I fully agree. The anti-plant-based people, we might say, keto, paleo, carnivore, ancestral diet kind of messages do very much the same thing, and their focus is always on blood sugar, right? Oh, you eat a potato, you eat beans, look at how much your blood sugar is supposed to go up. Like you said, if chronically I show that people who eat beans and potatoes have blood sugar abnormalities and difficulty regulating blood sugar and higher risk of type 2 diabetes, then that might be something concerning. But just saying a person who eats more carbohydrate at a meal has a bigger spike in blood sugar immediately postprandial than somebody who eats nothing but, butter after a meal, that doesn't tell me much. Of course their blood sugar goes up more. And so, yes, with these sorts of studies that then to come up often of this, no, look at how impaired flow mediated dilation became, yeah, exactly. But like you said, exercise does that, stress does that, body pot. There's so many things that can do that. What I care about, what we're supposed to care about is decades of practice. Do people have worse flow mediated dilation? There's a lot of research that shows that olive oil users have better endothelial function. But like you said, if somebody really feels wonderful not using olive oil, they on an oil-free diet and their health is where they'd like it to be, it keeps their pain away, it keeps their weight within a healthy range, it keeps their blood sugar, marvelous. The good news is olive oil is not an absolute necessity for health. But many people don't want to eat without oil. I remember giving a talk to a group of people once about heart health, and I wasn't there to speak about oil one way or the other. I had just casually mentioned Dean Ornish because I was talking about how his program is reimbursed by insurance here, and everybody in the crowd went, "Oh." I said, "What?" Like, "Oh, somebody here was trying to get this, and we all tried to do it, and we hated it, and we couldn't do it for more than a few days because the food was so bland and boring." And I said, "Well, are you still at least eating lots of vegetables?" And they said, "No, we couldn't stick with the diet." And I said, "Oh, that's a problem because the message could have just been, here are the benefits of getting more and more and more plant-based foods. Use oil, don't use oil, regardless, just do what's going to make you get those veggies in and see how things go with your health." The other thing that concerns me about the anti-oil message is I think a lot of it is rooted in body shaming and anti-fatness and this idea that health means you have to be incredibly thin, and therefore higher calorie dense foods are immediately bad for you because they're going to have more of a caloric value. And yes, for people that are trying to make significant changes in their body weight range, going on less oil or no oil for a certain period of time or a long period of time can be very helpful for doing that. But that's just because it's a convenient way of reducing overall calorie intake while still feeling full. It doesn't make oil fattening or make oil evil. I had someone say to me once that they were told by a whole food plant-based organization that they should imagine that they have a hungry pig inside of them. And every time they crave those foods, it's the pig. And I just thought that's they were on the verge of crying. They were so offended. This was a middle-aged female, heavier body size, who was just told by a man that she had a pig inside of her. And she was just mortified by this, and I apologized because I had said, "Oh, if you're looking for a coaching program, you might want to check this organization out." And here they are telling her she's a pig because she wants to use oil in her food. So this kind of body shaming is becoming more common, I think, in our plant-based community because of this idea that nuts and seeds and avocados and oils have higher calorie density, so therefore they must immediately be bad for me. I heard a very well-known plant-based person in this field say that if they so much as look at a nut, they get fat. And they were applauded for that statement, as opposed to highly questioned for saying something that could be so damaging emotionally, if nothing else, to a lot of people that are struggling with healthy weight management. So I would love to see us get away from this message of oil and nuts and seeds being bad because they have higher fat contents. Blanket general statement for the entire population.
You've both touched on some key elements of the fact that we need to be more engaging, because this is a very niche group, those that follow a whole food, plant-based, no oil, no salt, to limit your nuts and seeds. I mean, what is this, a diet? We've got a health crisis around the world, especially in the Western society. We've got an environmental crisis. So if not for your health, we need to look at what we're putting on our plate for environmental reasons. If we're going to make this food shit, taste bland, no flavor, especially when you're coming from a very salt heavy, fat heavy and so on, you're not going to engage people to change. And the rule we always have is the vegan food has got to taste good. Okay, right. And doesn't mean put copious amounts of oil on there, but if it takes a little bit of a drop to change the flavor, to make it more palatable, I think that's important. And we've gone through our own journey through the lentil intervention, where I think initially we weren't as hard, but you got to give up meat. Whereas now the message is eat less meat, but actually let's focus more on eating more of the good things. So, I think that's important with this whole message is if it's turning people off, then you've lost them. But to have some kind of, a little bit of a compromise somewhere. And when you've got the likes of, and I remember when I read this, I'm holding up the book, The Truth About Food by David Katz. He's a fan of oil. And I remember when I first read it, I was still the whole no oil. I thought, I don't know. But this guy's highly respectable. Dr. Joel Kahn, fan of oil. So, you talk about all these conferences and presentation. Well, the reality is there's certain affiliations or certain groups that is their policy. And I think that's the problem. If you want to be part of the cool kids or you want to be presenting to bigger numbers, then you've got to conform, whether it's what you normally do or not. But for the sake of, well, they're going to get 1,000 people. So I better sell the message right. But the flat out question right now is, because this is the question we get asked a lot, are there actual health benefits to oil? Or is it simply that, well, it's just not having an ill effect? It's almost, it's like having salt in miso soup. It kind of nullifies the fact, the ill effects of salt. So having oil in your salad and your vegetables, is that actually an issue? Or are there actual health benefits?
Wonderful question. And what we can see is that, especially for what we might call, and I even hesitate to use this kind of language, but maybe good quality oils, like a good, true extra virgin olive oil, does tend to be very high in what are called phenolic compounds. That's, if you taste really good quality extra virgin olive oil, it's almost spicy, it's almost peppery, like rocket or arugula would be. These phenols do appear to have some specific health benefits. They appear to reduce oxidative stress, which again might be very helpful for actually supporting endothelial function, so keeping the heart healthy. The other thing is oil is a source of fat, and there are a lot of nutrients that require fat for absorption. So for people that are very stringently anti-oil, they need to make sure they're getting in adequate fats, whether that's from nuts, seeds, avocados, or other sorts of foods, because they may not be able to absorb their vitamin A, their vitamin E, vitamin K, and other things quite as efficiently, especially as we age. As we age, our digestive system is not maybe what it once was, and it can be a bit harder to absorb these nutrients. And having that additional carrier of some fat to aid in that absorption, especially for an older adult population, might be very important. On the flip side, younger children, especially if they're physically active or going through a lot of metabolic activity, that concentrated source of calorie in a small period of space in a tiny little belly can make sure that they're getting in enough calories. The other thing is that oil can help to support keeping our certain cholesterol markers like HDL cholesterol on the higher side. People that go very low oil, or I shouldn't say low oil because that's not even the right way to think about it, but just extremely, extremely low fat. Yes, they will drop their LDL, but they will drop their HDL too. A lot of anti-oil people, I think, try to make the claim that that's not a problem. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but sort of, again, this blanket message of don't worry about it is concerning, where using some oil does help to keep your HDL a bit higher as your LDL drops, which again might have some specific benefits to our heart. But the phenols, these phenolic compounds in true extra virgin olive oil definitely do seem to potentially have some ability to quench oxidative stress and support the functioning of the endothelial system. If somebody still said, nope, I never want to eat a drop of olive oil the rest of my life, I would say that's fine and they can still be very healthy. But it's maybe not necessary for everybody to do in the pursuit of good health.
Sums it up pretty nicely, I think. Let's pivot slightly then. You've already touched on it a little bit, but similar types of messaging with other food components like macronutrients, like protein, for example. I'm sure every vegan gets sick of, saying, yeah, I get enough protein. Honestly, I do. But some circles within the plant-based world really are very dismissive of it being important at all, and if you eat enough potatoes you'll be fine.
I know.
Is this the case throughout your lifespan, or potentially should we be prioritizing protein a little more potentially as we age, or importance in regards to bone health and I'll stop rambling now, but I'll let you take
No,
over because you're much more succinct than me. But
no, not in the slightest. Yes, it does appear that as we age, protein becomes more important. Older adults older adults who start to introduce meat into their diet do tend to live a bit longer and have less osteoporosis-related fracture than those who don't. That isn't to say that as we age, whether we like it or not, we have to incorporate meat into our diet, but it's the recognition that to prevent that protein wasting, muscle wasting, sarcopenia as we age, digestion isn't quite what it once was. We may need more protein as we age, especially at a certain point, maybe around 50s or 60s or higher. Right now, in the very don't worry about it protein circles, the message that I typically hear is all you need is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo body weight. That's all you'll ever need. Well, the research shows that actually as we age, something more like 1.2, 1.4 grams of protein per kilo of body weight might be better to prevent some of these age-related deterioration. So it does need to adjust as our health changes and as we age. The other thing is, and like you said, that now it's getting flipped on its side, where as long as you eat lots of potatoes and spinach, there's more protein in a gram of spinach than there is a gram of, these messages that we hear of, I eat spinach and broccoli, I don't need to worry about protein. I have just personally seen a lot of underweight and malnourishment in certain people who have come to me for counseling, who maybe had been listening to these messages for some time, and they are not necessarily thriving, especially if they're following this dual message of low calorie, low fat, low protein, combined with lots and lots and lots and lots of exercise. So because I've got to exercise, so I've got to run, and I've got to do this, and I've also got to eat nothing but salad all day, and they end up getting very ill. And so do most people who are affluent enough to be able to purchase food without issue, who are able to get a diversity of food in their diet, need to worry about protein, especially when we are young and healthy? Most likely not. But it's the dual recognition that protein is a nutrient that has importance like any, and so I shouldn't dismiss it. And it is possible to eat a whole food plant-based diet and not get in enough protein. Typically, probably because I'm not getting enough total calories in general. So again, we want to make sure we're not being too calorie phobic. But then also, especially as we age, and recognizing the changes in bone density, changes in muscle mass, changes in weight, that we need to ensure we're taking in enough. There was a study that came out not too long ago, a part of the EPIC Oxford study that was conspicuously not mentioned by a lot of the plant-based individuals, that showed that even when you adjust for body weight, vegans had higher rates of osteoporosis than non-vegans. And that, yes, part of that might be explained by vegans had smaller BMIs, don't tend to have as much overweightness, and we know as we age, having a little extra body weight protects us against osteoporosis. But even when they adjusted for weight, the vegans still had higher rates of osteoporosis. That is something we should be asking ourselves of, what is it, because we're not getting enough protein at certain key points? Is it because of maybe other nutrient deficiencies? Should we be taking creatine supplements? What is the reason why this might be? But because it's contrary to the message of, well, I don't drink milk, so therefore I'll never get osteoporosis. I eat lots of greens and beans and potatoes, so therefore I never need to worry about protein. That this idea of almost immortality through plant-based eating, that I think leads to a lot of people perhaps finding themselves in otherwise preventable states of poor health.
Now, we're not talking about straight away putting an ultra-processed isolated protein powder into a smoothie. We're talking about having a well-balanced, diverse diet, that perhaps having an extra serving of legumes or having an extra serving of nuts or whatever, to get that high rate of protein. Because even at a 1.2, 1.4, and you mentioned calorie deficiency, if you're consuming the required minimum amount of calories you should be consuming, then that ratio works itself out.
Exactly.
That 10 to 15%.
For the most part. But if you've got a really small, petite, elderly lady who struggles with their total calorie intake, they will need to concentrate a little bit more on making sure that they've got enough protein on their plate, as opposed to, Ben, you're out running ultra marathons, you're good.
Exactly. I mean, these products that exist that sometimes we turn our noses up as being ultra processed, like protein drinks, and they can serve a really wonderful role for people who are undernourished, malnourished, maybe frail, older adult, somebody who has a digestive disease or abnormality where they aren't able to digest and absorb nutrients quite the same way. Somebody that might be recovering from severe surgery or burns or other sorts of tissue healing. These can have really wonderful benefits, but the people that might tell us we don't necessarily need to worry about them typically are in good states of health, right? Yeah, they're physically active, able to eat enough. So exactly, it's quite easy for a healthy, food secure a person to be able to get in enough protein from a variety of sources. But even some of the more typical higher concentrated source protein foods like tofu, tempeh, maybe seitan, often sometimes get demonized by certain people within the whole food plant-based world as well they're too high in fat. Soy foods have too much calorie density, they have too much fat within them. You need to avoid them. Seitan is ultra processed and fake and you shouldn't eat it, it's bad for you. And for a lot of people, this is how they start eating a plant-based diet, is because they go to a restaurant and they get the tofu stir fry. And if that suddenly becomes off balance and that becomes out of, then I might as well not bother doing it in the first place, because what is left to eat? Because if it goes from, it has to be not just vegan, but whole, and it has to have no oil and no added salt and no added sugar, and the diet becomes so narrow that a person inadvertently could end up not getting enough protein because they're not getting enough calories because they're only eating salads and steamed rice all day because that's the thing they only feel is healthy that's left.
Supplements play an important role, and like you say, you've mentioned some scenarios where they're absolutely crucial. But the unfortunate scenario with supplements in general, like protein, it's more of a marketing's dream right now. And
Yes.
this has been boosted by protein. This has got 30 grams in this bar. You need to eat this bar. But let's talk about a very specific supplement, and that is creatine. You've mentioned it. We know that in the sporting world, there's been a lot of studies that have shown supplementation can improve anaerobic capacity, strength, even recovery. So in the athletic world, yes. Now, creatine in general, the natural form, so to speak, comes from eating meat. So on a plant-based diet, is there any benefit in including a supplementation of creatine? And that can be derived, I think, from synthetic or plant-based sources. I'm not sure, but
Yes,
you can get vegan sources. But is there a value in supplementing something that we don't actually really derive from our general eating?
The creatine's an interesting one because of all the sports supplements, it's probably been studied more than almost any other. So if nothing else, we can certainly confidently say that it appears to be quite safe to use. I personally do use creatine, and one of the things that led me to start to do that was actually this EPIC Oxford study, because our bodies do produce creatine. It's a non-protein compound. We will theoretically produce the creatine we need, but meat, and specifically red meat, does have a very significant quantity of creatine within it. So if a person eats that as part of their diet, that will add to the total creatine load of their body. Well, when this EPIC Oxford study came out, the question was not just why are the vegans having more osteoporosis than the meat eaters, but even the fish eaters had higher rates of osteoporosis-related fracture compared to the meat eaters. So it wasn't just animal food versus no animal food. There seemed to be something. One study proves nothing, but at least in this study, it seemed to be what would be specific to red meat that might be allowing these people to not suffer as many osteoporosis-related fracture than to even other people who include animal-based foods within their diet but are not eating red meat. And there's a lot of reason why even animal food eaters, benefit from not eating red meat. There's few things you could really say would be all that different. Creatine, though, content is rather significantly different between red meat versus other forms of animal food. So perhaps there might be some benefit that goes beyond the athletic or that goes beyond the sport. One thing that creatine can help is to pull more water into the muscle. Some people take creatine purely for its aesthetic quality to try to bulk up their muscle mass a bit and pull more water in. Well, muscle that's well hydrated does tend to be a bit stronger, less likely to injury, less likely to deteriorate. So there might be, again, especially if we think about it across the lifespan as we age, there might be some benefit to the preservation of muscular strength and muscular mass for using creatine, especially in an older adult population. We know that vegetarian and vegan athletes, or just generally active people who add creatine to their diets, do seem to perform a bit better just because they are increasing the creatine load. I have not seen enough that would lead me to say it's one of those must supplement things like a vitamin B12 or a few others that really most people eating a plant-based diet really should be supplementing with. But I personally, for whatever this is, I have myself started to add about 5 grams of creatine mixed in a glass of water to my daily routine. I've personally noticed some positive benefit in my exercise and my performance in that area. Should the tides change and show that creatine is very harmful, I would certainly stop. And I don't necessarily recommend it to other people as one of those things that they must start. But just from what I have started to see a bit in terms of what might explain why those who consume red meat later in life might actually do a bit better, creatine content of that red meat may be one of those factors that are maybe helping us as we age not suffer from frailty, loss of muscle mass, fracture, those sorts of things.
So at the end of the day, I think my take-home messages from this is it's about nuance, basically. And
Absolutely.
we can't just apply one thing to absolutely everyone. And I think another really important point that you've touched on is the importance of empowering people rather than just preaching at them and saying, you cannot do this, rather than concentrate on all the beautiful things that you can be adding in and the enjoyment that comes with eating a diverse plant-based diet, rather than just solely focusing on the negatives. And if you have one drop of oil, you'll drop dead of a heart attack, you know?
Exactly. No, I couldn't say it better myself. What I always worry about when, again, kind of coming back to our earlier part, when Western scientific methods kind of get their holds into things, is it tends to, again, strip culture away, and it kind of leaves things as purely measurable, quantifiable amounts. And I've seen a great number of people in the pursuit of health, as noble and important as that is, deny their culture, move away from their culture, move away from foods that are quite meaningful and important to them. They isolate, they don't go out with friends, they don't socialize with people because the restaurant can't guarantee that the vegetables aren't sauteed in some olive oil. And it just becomes, unfortunately, a damaging effect on their well-being as opposed to an empowering one. So absolutely, food should always be a source of pleasure. And the best research that is done on nutrition looks at patterns, overall habits versus individual nutrients in foods. And thankfully, we can say right now with great confidence that the patterns definitely show. Those of us who eat a very high percentage of our diet from whole or minimally processed plant-based foods seem to derive a number of health benefits. All of the other stuff is, like you said, it's just nuance. Maybe I use some salt, maybe I don't. I use some oil, maybe I don't. Maybe I take a sports supplement like creatine, maybe I don't. Those are such minor details compared to the larger message that we should be sharing with people. And just because you mentioned David Katz before, Ben, I really love a quote of his that he had shared, I don't think too long ago, which was his recommendation that nutritional science should almost stop at this point trying to make recommendations for individual people, because the biggest crisis facing us is the environmental and climate one. We may want to start thinking about our food choices more in this area because of the immediacy of this danger versus whether I myself individually consume salt with my food or not.
The quote, "As I learn ever more from environmental experts, I find that our debates about diet for human health are apt to become more mute very soon. The impact of our prevailing diets on the planet is fast becoming the only thing that really matters. There will be no point in debating diet for human health on a planet no longer hospitable to human habitation, and we are blithely and blindly blundering in that very direction." That's the quote.
Perfect.
Well, I was going to end off with a social media quote, actually, nutritionfacts.org, that posted it just a few days ago. Eating healthfully is not about vegetarianism, veganism, or any other ism. From a nutrition standpoint, the reason I don't like the terms vegetarian and vegan is that they are defined by what you don't eat. And I think that's what this whole discussion has been about. And you've wrapped it up already succinctly, in terms of where the focus really does need to be. And as Emma pointed out, these nuances of we're so quick to pick apart a study on keto and say, oh, that's where the problem is. But hey, we are very good at turning a blind eye to our own studies. And I think, the one study we didn't even surprisingly mention in this whole discussion is the blue zones. And, that I think really sums it up, is what are the fundamentals? Eat more vegetables, eat more plants, and so on. The social aspect, having purpose, all that kind of stuff. Some have oil, the Mediterranean diet. Some don't. Some have salt. In fact, probably all of them have salt. Mm-hmm. They all eat minimal amount of meat. We know the ill effects of too much meat in a diet. So I think we can wrap it up here. It's you have been absolutely wonderful, Anthony. I've mentioned at the beginning, I'll mention it again. The importance of communication in the field of science is crucial. We haven't said it enough in the space of health and nutrition. So thank you so much for coming onto the show, for being that wonderful communicator. And really, it's just common sense. It's logic. And it's about being inclusive. And I think that's been super important. So thank you so much.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you. Thank you both for giving me the opportunity to chat with you. This is wonderful.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.